It's bigger than biotech.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of It's Bigger Than Biotech, the podcast where we explore the people, ideas, and paths shaping the future of life sciences. Whether you're a student trying to find your footing or a professional navigating your next move, you're in the right place. Today's episode is one that bridges two worlds, academia and industry, and dives deep into what it means to drive innovation at the intersection of both. Joining us today is Dr. Llewellyn Cox, the Executive Director of Corporate Relations for Life Sciences Innovations at the University of Southern California. He has a PhD in molecular cell biology. Dr. Llewellyn's career has woven through some of the most exciting corners of biotech, from founding Lab Launch and Mars Bio to building ecosystems that empower scientists to turn ideas into real world therapies. With experience across incubators, venture capital, and university innovation hubs, Dr. Llewellyn is on a mission to connect visionaries with resources. And he's learned a thing or two along the way about storytelling, leadership, and how to build a meaningful career in biotech that isn't dictated by job titles, but driven by impact. So, without further ado, let's get right into it.
And so, my first question to you would be, you've worked at the intersection of academia, biotech innovation, and ecosystem building. How would you describe your current role at USC and the broader impact you're trying to drive through by doing corporate relationships in the life sciences?
Sure, yeah. And so my current role at USC, I'm Executive Director of Corporate Relations. So essentially, my role is to be the lead person partnering with corporate partners across the university, particularly really large companies that have very broad interests, and so might be interested in research that's going on particularly in more than one or even across multiple schools. And so, in a lot of ways, really, my job is to be a translator. It's to work with our faculty and our leadership to understand what the really big opportunities that we have at USC are, where we are really at the cutting edge of science, and communicate that to our corporate partners so that we can ultimately co-invest with them on developing those technologies and making sure that they get translated efficiently, into the marketplace where they can make a real difference in people's lives.
Okay, I see. And this is a very interesting field because as a student I didn't know that universities operated like this, almost like a business in a sort of way where you're looking for potential cooperators from outside the industry coming in and working with universities. And it's very important, of course, because all of innovation is fueled by institutions such as USC. Um, However, for a student that may not know exactly what you do, is there an example you can give them of what your day would look like on a daily basis?
That's a good question because I think my day is very, very different depending on what day it is. If I can give you an example, like today is Monday. My Friday consisted of 8 a.m. having a breakfast meeting with a representative from Amazon to talk about the future of, we have a center in the Viterbi School of Engineering based around AI. We're looking to, that's actually coming up for renewal at the end of this year. So we're starting that process of talking to them about, how that's worked out over the last few years, what that looks like in terms of growing our relationship going forward, introducing some of the other areas of the university where we have real expertise that might be valuable to them as they think about their business models across, they have 50 something different businesses within Amazon. So, beyond AI, there's, logistics, there's Amazon Web Services. They're interested in quantum computing. They're really interested in healthcare. All of these are areas where USC brings a lot of intersectional expertise and has some really foundational innovations going on. So, we're trying to kind of build the case that we can grow and expand that relationship and explore really what that looks like in terms of a deal. Later that day, I was talking to a major biopharmaceutical company. I was helping edit some, faculty summaries to talk about how they can partner more specifically on new candidates for drug development. And I finished my day writing up a summary of the IBM USC Quantum Innovation Center. So, in one day, I jumped from AI to biopharmaceuticals back to quantum computing. It's a privilege to have this role because I get to be exposed to so much fantastic science across the university, but as well be able to tell that story from USC's point of view so that it makes sense to our partners who are working in the private sector and help them understand how partnering with us can actually benefit their business going forwards.
I see. And one thing that really interests me is when you're meeting with all these people, you're switching industries quite often and you're having conversations with people from industry like multiple times during a day. So, how does the technical jargon change by each conversation? And how technical do you have to be? Like, are you well versed in life science terminologies, AI terminologies? Like, how well versed do you have to be?
That's a really good question. So obviously, I come from a background with a PhD in molecular and cell biology. And I've worked in biotech for most of my adult life. So I feel relatively confident that I can have a very strong conversation with scientists in that space. In other areas where AI, like quantum computing, it's more challenging because obviously I don't have a deep technical background in those levels. But that's part of my role coming into USC was to have to be a quick study, really understand, at least from a high level point of view, what the key terms, what the basic terminology that outlines the technology is. When you're talking about partnerships and deals with private companies, in the first instance, you don't really have to be that detailed. At the end of the day, we're talking about broad strokes, what a big picture partnership might look like. As we kind of drill down and talk about specific technologies, that's where, typically we would then look to bring in our faculty to have that more nuanced conversation where they can really have that scientist to scientist interaction. So in a way, it's my job to be able to fake it a little bit to understand the big pictures of what's going on. But at the same time, you need to have a reasonable understanding of the field. But again, that's something that's pretty necessary to be successful in any field, especially in the modern scientific workplace where the intersection of technologies is a growing force and just keeps to be something that's going to continue growing as we go forward. So you can no longer, certainly in the private sector, really be that deep in just one thing and be able to talk super expertly. You need to understand at least the basics of how other fields are intersecting, with your technology, so that you can have those meaningful cross-functional conversations.
Right, definitely. And in your role, it's very important to have meaningful conversations. Like you said, the other party should not feel like you're half researched on what they want to do. And so, my question to you was: do you have a routine that you do before you talk to a new party, a third party that you want to collaborate with? Like, is there background research, or is there like a certain routine you do that other people can also learn from when approaching, maybe talking to a new person or something of the sort?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this goes to kind of a fundamental principle that I'm a big fan of. And there's a joke someone told me many years ago, and I forget who told me it, but they said there's only two things you actually learn in grade school. In elementary school, you learn how to play nice with other people, and in high school, you learn how to do your homework. If you can do those two things, you can be successful in life, and everything else is just data. And while it's a little flippant, I really kind of do believe in that. And I think it gets lost on a lot of people, even experienced people in the industry, the importance of doing homework and preparation. So, when I came into this role just about 18 months ago now, this was a big conversation I had because, again, coming in, knowing kind of half the portfolio, the health side, I feel confident talking about that. But, I also work with a lot of the big tech companies, Amazon, IBM, Google. It's really important to do your homework. So that means, from my point of view, really reading deeply into the companies, reading all those quarterly reports, reading their shareholder reports, looking at what's happening in the marketplace, looking at their product development portfolios. So even though 95% of it's probably not going to be relevant to your conversation, you need to have that deep understanding of who this company is, what their driving force is, what their big picture goals are, because that's going to enable you to have a meaningful conversation going forward. This is true of individuals as well as companies, because at the end of the day, doing a deal with someone or giving them a product is about solving problems, right? At the fundamental, that's what all things do, right? That's why I got into science in the first place. Science is about solving problems. Turns out product development is about solving problems. All good products solve some problem in someone's life. And so understanding the big picture of a company or an individual can help you understand essentially like where their pain points are, what actually keeps them up at night, what do they worry about as a company going forwards. That's where there's space for partnership and opportunity to do something meaningful going forward as a collaboration.
Definitely. And usually with research, what are your favorite sources? Like you mentioned, there's a 10K reports, the shareholder reports. These are for public companies, but what about individuals? Like, how would you approach if you were a student and you had to reach out to a professional in the industry? How would you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, individuals is an interesting one. Some people could be a little tricky, but for the most part, a lot of people have a very large digital footprint, and it's not that hard to really interrogate from, without having proprietary tools. Now, one of the advantages we have working in USC advancement is we have a lot of really kind of scary tools actually to look into people's, everything from their net worth to their historical philanthropy giving. All of these can be scraped from public sources. There's specialized companies that, pull that data together and present it in a meaningful way. And again, increasingly using AI to do that. But you can find out, a lot about someone on just LinkedIn, looking at their socials, like, just Google them, see what they've read, see what they've written. If you're thinking about academics or people in industry, have they given any talks? Are those available online? So, there's an awful lot of internet stalking you can do ahead of time before meeting someone, even just to give yourself kind of a 10,000 foot point of view. Who is this person I'm going to be talking to? What's important to them? How do they present themselves to the world? And that can tell you a lot about like what, drives them internally.
Definitely. I wanted to slightly switch gears now into more looking into your experience in the past, because you ran a biotech incubator and you still facilitate strategic partnerships. What core skills or mindsets have you found that are truly non-negotiable for success in the life science innovation field?
I think more than anything, and this goes far beyond life sciences, your ability to communicate. That's one of the reasons why, my kind of main side hustle is teaching science communications, because it's a total obsession of mine. But there is simply no skill in life in any field whatsoever, whether you're in a technical life science field, whether you're in tech, whether you're in fashion design like my wife, your ability to talk to someone about what it is you're doing and communicate clearly the what and why is absolutely indispensable. There's no substitute for it. And it simply is the biggest differentiator of success in anyone's field, is how to talk to someone meaningfully about what they're doing and in a way that helps them understand it and empathize. And that's the key thing as well. It's not just being able to sound super smart. It's about communicating in a way that people feel both enlightened, educated, but not condescended to at the same time, which is a trap that I think a lot of scientists fall into, is treating everyone else like they're dumb. The ability to be a communicator, to talk to people outside of your field, by far and away is the biggest thing. When I was working in incubation, right, I came into it wonderfully naive and thinking about the science side of things and commercialization, and sure. But, to do that, I had to start learning about real estate and construction and facility management, and OSHA and hazardous waste protocols, all of these things that you just don't necessarily touch day to day. But, as a manager of that group, you don't have to necessarily do all these things yourself. That's why you hire people. But you have to understand what it is they're doing, or you're not going to be able to make good choices. Having a broad outlook and being able to communicate well, I think are really the two kind of key things that, stand anyone apart.
Definitely. And you honestly, like, you came from a scientific background and you had very deep scientific training to begin with. And so, how did that training influence the way that you think about entrepreneurship, leadership, and innovation today?
It's a good question. So I mean, I think honestly, the other than the technical stuff that we were researching, I think what really doing a PhD and then a postdoc really instilled in me was having a very, for want of a better phrase, scientific process about going about your work. And understanding that literally everything follows the same pattern is if you think about it in kind of science terms, right, is um, look at all the information that's out there and craft a hypothesis to explain X. Once you have that, design experiments to test X. If those experiments show that X is true, what is the next step? And frankly, that's sort of the process of anything, of putting anything together is what don't I know? How can I understand what I don't know? Okay, is this a good fit? Finding a way to test that idea and then putting it into practice. That's fundamentally, that's product development, that's deal making, that's pretty much every single aspect of doing business. So, really it is a case of understanding, having a process and going in through it rigorously, step by step, not skipping steps. That's where you can make mistakes. I think that to me is the biggest lesson in terms of how to be, effective in putting together, complex jobs, deals, those kind of things. I think leadership is a different thing altogether. I'm not sure I learned too much about it in the academic world, to be honest. I think it's not that controversial to say there's a bit of a dearth of leadership in academia. Um, but I think one of the most important things I've learned about leadership is it's not a noun, it's a verb. You're not a leader because you have a fancy title or because someone says this is the leader. You're a leader because you physically lead. You show people the way to go, and if they understand what you're doing, they buy into it and they follow you. That's leading. So it's more of an interactive thing rather than a kind of a designation.
Definitely. I had quite a few thoughts when you were giving your response, but the one that was the most interesting was that since this is a podcast about students figuring out careers, one parallel that could possibly exist is how do you use the scientific process to kind of help navigate your career? Like, do you think that mentality or that framework applies to finding a career in sciences, or do you feel like that's a completely different ballgame?
I think it does to an extent, and I think one of the hardest things that you have to do, especially as an early career person, when you're in grad school, or you're in college, or you're in your first couple of jobs, there's a lot of unknowns in the future, and so how do you plan for that, right? I'm famously will tell people that anything more than 5 years in the future is fiction. So any projection, more than 5 years out simply is just, hoping. So how do you kind of make those decisions? And I think what has become apparent to me and what I've learned over the years is in order to really be successful in whatever it is you're doing, you need to be contented in what you're doing. You need to be driven. There needs to be that internal will to want to do something. And really to find that sweet spot is it's an exercise in knowing yourself. And introspection is hard, and understanding and getting past your ego to understand what really drives you, I think is one of the most challenging, but one of the most meaningful things you can do, especially in the early part of your career, because there's a lot of motivations in the world, and there's no wrong answer. But understanding who you are and what drives you. Are you driven by money? Are you driven by external markers of success? Are you driven by self-contentment? Are you driven to do something you consider meaningful for the world? All of these things are valid, right? There's no wrong answers into what your inherent drive is, but understanding really and truly who you are internally, I think is frankly one of the hardest things to do, but one of the things that can set you up best for success, because that helps you identify really the role that you're going to both be most content and therefore most productive in. So again, it's hard to do, and I say you have to navigate this big roadblock called your ego to do it. But I think you can take that same kind of rigorous look at yourself and say you can break down the things you've done, the things that you do, the things you choose to do, and say step back and say what do I derive out of that? What motivates me to do this sport or have this hobby, or why did I decide to go to USC and not some other school? Why did I really make that decision? And it's okay to not know the answers, but I think having that level of introspection and really understanding who you are and what drives you as a person, I think is probably the most important thing you can do for yourself. I think set you up for a happy and productive career.
Definitely. So it's all about finding your why and why you do what you do, why you get out of bed every morning.
Exactly, yeah.
But one thing that kind of caught my attention was ego. Ego is very interesting to me because for a long time I've struggled with figuring out a fine line between self confidence and ego. So, just for our listeners, if you do have a separation or definition, what is ego according to you?
Yeah, and I'm probably being a little biased here, right? Because I'm definitely one of the people who'll be like, the death of ego is the source of enlightenment. And I think that's that actually is a little bit too simplistic. The ego, the sense of self, I think is really important. I think the challenge we have is when we allow our ego to tell a false narrative to ourselves, and it's very hard to admit that you can lie to yourself effectively. And it took me probably nearly 40 years to realize that. But your ego exists to protect yourself. At the end of the day, to give you a sense of self, to protect yourself from whatever's happening around you in the world, and that's its native function. But like anything else, I always think of, this is my background in biology, I think of everything biologically, and I think of everything in terms of evolutionary biology. That's just how my mind works. But as and that's okay, right? And it's shocking to look back and realize that those kind of events, when you literally dragged yourself out of the house by your fingernails and said, no, I paid $5 for this or whatever, to go out and meet people, have been times when I've met people who fundamentally changed my life, and I've learned something new or seen something that lights a spark and says, hey, this is a really cool thing that we could work on together. That's how you build your ideas. It's how you understand the nuances and the complexity of the world, and not like just sit in your own bubble at home scrolling through Instagram and just seeing one window. But it's also how you meet, your collaborators and partners. And again, it's hard to kind of talk about it too linearly, but it is incredible how many people you meet and get to know, even as just friends, that 10 years plus down the line circle back and you end up doing something with and working in a meaningful way with. That's ultimately how I ended up teaching at USC, because I met someone in New York 20 years ago at this point, and we hit it off about a mutual interest. Nothing happened for 10 years until we connected when they moved to LA, and I ended up being recruited to USC to come on as part-time faculty. So, there's, I think that's really the key to is connecting with human beings and understanding other people's needs and drives and outlooks in life can teach you an awful lot about where the opportunities and the challenges are.
Definitely. I feel like networking is a very important skill, but for most students, it's very intimidating because you're trying to reach out to people who are way above in their career. Maybe could be C-suite executives, or maybe something, or professionals who do something that the student might be interested in. What recommendation do you have for students trying to do outreach but are really struggling and finding it hard to do?
Yeah, it can be intimidating for sure, and I think something that I've learned over the years is a lot of, again, this kind of goes back to ego and the narratives we tell ourselves, right? Like you said, these people are super successful and have crazy cool job titles and are very important. Um, but something I've learned is that, we're all still that nervous teenager inside. That never goes away. Everyone in the entire world, except for narcissists, has imposter syndrome, and it never, ever goes away. You can be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You're going to have that same feeling going into a conversation with someone you don't know, albeit it's going to probably be a different level of person. But the same thing is true. You go into pitch something or do a deal, like you still have that sense of nervousness and like, oh God, what if, like, seriously, what if everyone just starts laughing at me and pointing and that kind of paranoia? That is universal. It never, ever goes away. So the only difference as an early career person is that you don't have the lifelong experience of understanding. That doesn't go away. You think it's you right now. And they're just humans. That's the other thing to understand is, again, the people you're talking to are just human beings, especially at a networking event. They're there for a reason, the same reason you're there for. They're there to meet people. And, it feels like a chore, but you say you do it because it's part of it's giving back, and right. But at the same time, you're looking to meet people. You're learning. You're looking to learn, right? So even you might not think it, but even as someone like a grad student, right? You meet someone who's an executive vice president of X, Y, some networking event. They're interested in learning from you, right? They want to know what you're working on, what's happening at your school. Like if you're working in a lab, what technology are you working on right now? They're there for a reason. They're there to learn from you, just as you are there to learn from them. So I know it's very trite to say it, but just simply taking a deep breath, calming yourself down, looking people in the eye, and just being interesting. That's the other thing that's the only thing that you think that it's intimidating to talk to, older people. Like, there's nothing more intimidating than when I go to a networking session. There's like 4 grad students surrounding you, just staring at you and saying nothing. It's like, it's scary. And it's an evolutionary response. Eyes staring at you means you're about to get eaten, right? So it's just a case of just, again, getting past that ego that tells you to protect yourself, and you're the subservient person in this relationship. You're the you're the interloper. Understanding that everyone's just there to meet other people, and just be willing to converse about yourself, what you think is interesting, what you're working on, and learn about other people. Like, there's no better intro at a networking event of, hi, my name is whatever. What do you do? And just listening to people and understanding what it is they do, and it's always enlightening, because there's a lot more to careers than you ever imagined before you get into them.
Right, definitely. I feel like the podcast has taught me a lot about that, honestly. Like, even reaching out to you, I was very intimidated, like, to talk to you for the first time, but honestly, I had an amazing conversation with you before, and I'm having an amazing conversation now. So this is really great. But I wanted to pivot to a very important section for students, which is recruitment, because that is also another very intimidating part of a student's journey. And you've built teams in startups and work closely with universities as well. So when recruiting talent, what intangible qualities stand out beyond just academic or technical excellence?
Yeah, good question. And again, I'm going to sound repetitive. It's communication skills. It's can you be are you interesting? Like seriously, because here's the thing, right? If you're recruiting for a startup, 3 people who work in a company of 4, or you're recruiting for a Fortune 500 company, and the HR has already done the huge big filter, and you're interviewing the final 3 candidates, right? You're actually making the same decision, right? By the time you get into an interview, which is kind of where we are right here, right? By the time you get to an interview, they have decided you are qualified to do the job, right? That's what your resume, that's what all the background screening, God help you if you have to do intelligence tests. I hate that. But that's what that whole process is for. By the time you get into an interview, you're basically asking the question, are you someone I want to spend more time with than my own family? Because that's the reality of it, right? When you're working in an office, you work in a lab, you work in any kind of team, these are the people you're going to spend 8-ish hours a day with, 47-ish weeks a year until, everyone everything goes wrong or everyone leaves. But, that's a big commitment. You literally do spend more time with your work colleagues than you do with your own family. So, that's really the fundamental question you're asking. Like, is this someone I can work with? Are they going to, be able to communicate well? And so I understand, where they are, what they're doing. Are they the kind of person who's going to be open and ask questions? Are they going to be able to share when they're struggling and ask for appropriate help? It's a big challenge early career people have. Like, you don't want to, it goes to the 2 extremes. You either don't ask for help and you get yourself down such a rabbit hole, you're screwed, or you're constantly asking for nuance and it's like, seriously, go work it out. You're an adult. But there's somewhere in the middle, right? And that's really what it is understanding by someone's personality, someone's communication skills, how effective they're going to be as someone that you can work with. You're looking, and it's sad, you're looking for that kind of intangible called fit, which, I think can be a big of a negative sometimes. But again, is this someone who fits into the mold of the kind of person that you're going to be able to work effectively with? So, there's a lot of nuances there, and, it's not always going to work out. But, that's where I say learning to have those good communication skills, to present yourself authentically. I think that's more important than anything because, sure, maybe you can put on an act and fake your way in, but then once, you're spending 40 hours a week with this person, all that pretense is going to melt away real quick. And you're going to get found out. So, that's the really important thing to communicate. As a hiring manager, you want to have the confidence that this is someone that, again, is going to be able to do good work, but work effectively with you as a team you can rely on, and be someone that you can build that relationship beyond simply giving them tasks to do. So again, it all comes down to communication skills, and skills are difficult but have to be practiced.
Definitely. And in terms of intangible skills, what about the tangibles? Like, let's say a student wanted to work as a corporate relationships executive director at USC. What would they need to have on their resume to be able to do that?
That's a good question. What I do right now is a very specialized field. But there's a number of parallels, across the university. So not to get too inside baseball, I work in a group called Advancement. There's about 500 people in the universities, and we are essentially the fundraising arm. Out of Advancement, maybe 500 people, 25 are what we call CFR, Corporate and Foundation Relations. And so, a lot of people in our field have actually come from the corporate side. They started in a corporation, maybe working in partnerships, external relations, and have jumped the ship. Conversely, there's a bunch of people I've worked with in CFR who've then gone to do the opposite job in corporate entities to be their university partnerships lead. And so I think in terms of the tangibles, it's obviously you need a technical background so that you can talk. Developed complex ways of thinking. We part of our mental setup is this thing called ego that we use to insulate ourselves from externalities, and that's a very important thing. But it's also a very powerful internal storyteller, and it can deceive you. So it's easy to fall into traps of thinking things that aren't necessarily true about yourself. So I think ego is actually it's an important part of understanding who you are. Like, what is your internal, true sense of self. But you also have to be very wary about understanding that, your sense of self is not always accurate. And you have to be, I think to be successful in life, you have to constantly reevaluate that and be like, am I really living true to my own values, to my own goals? Or am I just telling myself a story to make my life easier? And that's an easy mental trap I think we all fall into from time to time. But it can lead you down some very negative directions for yourself and your own happiness if you don't take the time and the effort to constantly question why it is you do what you do. I mean, question and find out you're right. That's okay. I say question and like everything you do is wrong. But I think it's important to look at, just like you do with a company, right? We're doing 95 things brilliantly, and these 5 things we're just not working so great at. It's not a negative. It's like those are the 5 things we need to work on to be 100%, right? That's how we go from great to champions. So that's a big way I kind of think about ego and how to manage kind of your own sense of self and worth.
Definitely. And so my next question is your why stable throughout your life, or is it constantly changing?
I wouldn't say it's constantly changing, but it evolves for sure. And I think that's just in a lot of ways that's a reflection of experience. It's a reflection of how your life changes as you go through it. I was always driven by finding solutions, right? That's what got me into science in the first place. But as a 20-something, when I first moved to the United States after I did my PhD, it was entirely about me. Like there was no other thoughts in my brain about like what makes me happy on a day-to-day basis and what I do for work. And sometimes those intersected. And I think as you just go through life, like, life gets more complicated, right? I'm married now. I have a wife. She's the most important thing to me. Right? I have dogs that I have to keep alive and feed and walk and all those kind of things. You have responsibilities outside of your day to day that, sometimes they're by choice, sometimes they're just part of, the bigger picture of the lifestyle you choose for yourself. So, I don't think it necessarily like changes like day to day, but, as you go through these changes in life and you have different, I don't like the word pressures, but you have different, inputs in your day-to-day experience, it does gradually evolve your outlook and again decide what's most important to me, and it maybe makes some of that decision making a little more complicated. At the same time, it can make it a lot more clear and straightforward. And I'll defer to people with children on that matter.
Definitely. But something I notice is that you've pivoted quite a lot in terms of your career. So, how has your why evolved over all these phases of your career? And what is your why currently?
Yeah, and I think that fundamentally my why has never really changed. It's always been about using science to make the world better. That's what drew me into the field in the first place. That's why I did a PhD. I moved to the US to do more exciting stuff. I think that's where, starting off, that's where I ran out of road for myself in academia. I didn't see, working in discovery research, I didn't see the outcomes. I didn't see how what I was doing was really going to significantly contribute to the world. And so we parted ways and I went a different way. And, I did a few different things essentially to learn more about the industry, because I realized I didn't understand the whole process from, I discover something in my lab to dot, 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 dot. It becomes a product that makes someone's life better. And so I did a few different things, and I learned a lot. And I think that's the other thing that's always driven me, is the desire to learn more. And I think that's an important thing. But I got pulled into the world of startups because I saw that opportunity to make something work. And then I got into this space where, living in Los Angeles and being involved with startups, we kept hearing, and this is about 15 years ago now, we kept hearing from investors, oh, you should move to San Francisco, you should move to Boston. I'm like, I already moved 5,000 miles from home. I don't want to go to San Francisco. If I want to live somewhere cold and wet, I'd have stayed in England. We see this problem, right? Why would a city with the size and the economy and the resources of Los Angeles, why should I have to leave? What's wrong here? And we realized, fundamentally it was a lack of space and support. So that's what led me to forming Lab Launch, first incubator in the space. It was about solving that problem in front of me. This whole idea, and you hear it a lot more in startups, but I think it's true in general, scratch your own itch. If you see something that bothers you in the world, don't wait around for someone else to fix it, because you're going to be waiting your whole life, right? Just fix it. And we built that, and then we started seeing other people come online and more activity in the LA area. We then realized there was this challenge with early stage funding, right? There's plenty of investable capital in LA, but there really wasn't that specialized, who's going to write that first check for a deep tech startup. And that's what led to Mars Bio, right? We formed a small venture capital firm locally to invest in LA. We partnered with County of Los Angeles and to help drive this forward. And so, it's about solving another problem. And then again, similarly, that's what kind of brought me back to USC just over a year ago. I was kind of looking for something new to do. I wanted to, get out there and, interact a little more with innovators where they are. Talking to various people, say, there's this disconnect between academic research and our industrial partners. And, it's going to be more and more important as we go forward, especially as we're starting to see new technologies bleed into everyday life, to build those connections, to accelerate the translation of discoveries into marketplace. And so I saw this as a role where, I could add a lot of value. Like I say, being that translator, helping the geniuses at USC who do the science, connect clearly and effectively with external partners who have the resources to take those discoveries and put them into practice. I don't know why it has ever changed. The tactics change, but the overall strategy, if there is such a thing, is still very much always been focused on, how can we fix problems using science?
That makes a lot of sense now that you say it. But one thing that really sticks out to me is that you've had so many experiences, but they all follow this one thing, and you're just finding new, higher leverage ways to get to your why. But one particularly important thing is you must have had to make a lot of tough decisions over your career. There must have been a lot of dilemmas, or do I pick this path or that path? What was the mindset that you feel like helped you the most? Like, how do you evaluate opportunities that you say yes to or no to? And what is your criteria for it?
Oh my God, that's a hard question. If I have one flaw, is I say yes too easily to a lot of things, that's probably the source of most of my tribulations in life. But it's a good question, and how you think about opportunities, I think is very important. I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer. I think a lot of it comes down to your risk tolerance, and again, this is a big part of understanding who you are. Again, there's obviously a lot of externalities that build into this, but for me, it's a case of I'll do a job until I feel like there's there's unstoppable momentum in that space, right? So I'm very much a 0 to 1 person. We started an incubator in LA. Okay, now there's like 4 or 5. There's different models out there. There's different spaces for different companies. Great, cool. That problem's solved, right? I'm not needed anymore. So what's the next problem? So, a lot of it to me is self-generated. A lot of, certainly this, I'd say the second half of my career has been a lot more self directed. And a lot of it has come about by kind of, thinking what's the next problem that needs solving and how can I best work to find a solution to that. And I know that sounds horribly simplistic. But I think the key to it comes down to relationships and talking to people and constantly talking to people. One thing I talk about a lot in class when I'm teaching and when I do career seminars and those kind of things is the importance of networking. And this used to really annoy me when I was a student because everyone says, "Oh, you've got to network." And I'm like, what does that mean, right? Like, what is networking? Right. And I came to learn over the years, it's simply talking to people you don't know and learning about what they do. Because that's really how you learn about people's lived experiences, what keeps them up at night, what their challenges are. It's how you uncover new problems and new opportunities. And so, when I was first starting a startup, I hate this. I'm an introvert by nature. And I made a deal with my wife. Is like, I'm going to go to a networking event. I'm going to talk to 3 people I don't know before I run home and cry knowledgeably about, the subjects that you're covering. Obviously, like any career, the lower down the ladder you are, the more specialized you are. As you ascend any kind of organization, you need to be more and more of a generalist. And I don't think that's ever been more true than it is today. And you have that, right? You're all doing degrees for a top class university, but I think beyond simply, I have a bachelor's in molecular biology, whatever. It's about communicating what particular skills and knowledge bases you really have. And so, being able to talk knowledgeably but casually about like what your senior thesis was about. If you worked in a lab, like what techniques did you use? Being able to think a little bit more broadly around, because your resume tells you like it's the cliff notes, right? These are the courses you did. This is the grades you got. Great. But what did you actually learn? Like, what was interesting to you? And that's how, again, you can convey that sense of who you are by talking about like the work you've done in a way that, I studied this and I thought this was really interesting. And so I joined Dr. Whatever's lab and, they had me learning this technique and that was really challenging, but, I learned this and this is how I troubleshooted something, whatever. Just having that nuanced conversation about what it is you did rather than, beyond that headline on your resume. I think that's what's really important as you kind of think about technical skills.
Definitely. And just following that question, it's a pretty small question, but do grades matter? Like, does GPA matter when you're going for a role? Because I know a lot of students stress about, I need a 4.0 or 3.9. But realistically, does it even matter?
No.
Yeah.
I'll caveat that maybe. I know there's certain certainly larger employers at the very entry level, like that might be something they look at. And again, this is the kind of thing, no human's looking at that. That's the robot, right? Everything is an online resume builder now, and you're trying to trick your way past the AI to get to talk to a real person. So I think there's a caveat that actually, some companies might look at that, especially straight out of school. But here's the thing. No one cares about the last thing before the last thing you did. So, at this point, no one cares where I went to school. No one cares that I have a bachelor's. It's sort of a footnote that I have a PhD because that was like nearly 20 years ago now that I got that, right? It's sort of interesting what I did as a postdoc because it's science and it's still an emerging field. Right. But, it is really kind of true. People only really care about the last thing you did. So, again, once you've done your first, real job, or you've done a higher degree, no one cares about your bachelor's anymore. It's not to say don't try and study and be top of your class if you can, get the best grades you can. But again, there's, you know, the further you go along your career path, the less and less it matters.
Okay, definitely, definitely. And now pivoting towards more of a macro scale of the industry in general, where do you feel, and your role especially, where do you feel like corporate relationships arm for universities are headed in the next 5 years, and what do you see for that future?
Yeah, I mean, the next few years, particularly, I think corporate relations are going to become more and more important. We're in a space right now that, for reasons, the federal government is taking a large step back from their engagement with the innovation economy, and obviously that's causing some challenges, internally. But that's where we need to find new ways of doing things. This is the challenge with challenges. It's very easy to sit in your armchair and say, well, this isn't right and this isn't, good and well, and you can be right, but you're not changing anything. And that's a big trap I think we all can fall into. Um, and I heard this from actually my the head of my, I guess, division, Scott Rabinold, the university's vice president for advancement. He came up with this phrase recently when we were talking about culture. Culture is a big conversation topic at USC right now. And he was just like, be the cultural change you want to see in the world. And I think that was, as an invocation for us to be leaders, but to take responsibility. And so for the relatively small group of folks who I work with at the university who deal with corporate relations, we see that as our role, that we need to make the case to corporations that ultimately, especially in high-tech fields, their pipeline, their future goods and products are entirely reliant on discovery research that we do at universities. In a world where that is supported at a lower level than it has historically been, we need them to step up and be more active partners in that space. And we've already started to see that trend. I think that's going to continue to be, growing. And I think that can lead to a lot of new opportunities as well. Again, your average corporation is not going to just give you a grant. Some do. And we hope they continue to, and we hope they get bigger. But really and truly, if you're going to do something really significant, partnering with a major corporation, it needs to be a partnership. There needs to be a benefit for both sides in doing a deal together. And I think that leads to a lot of great opportunities in terms of thinking about how we can more effectively commercialize our work, how we can put products out into the world that do, make people's lives better. Because ultimately, that's what our corporate partners are really, really good at, right? We're really, really good at discovery research. They're really good at understanding product market fit and getting things into consumers' hands in a scalable manner. There's a partnership to be made there where we can work effectively together to maybe not make up this gap, but to reimagine how we do research and how it leads to positive changes for the world around us. So I think it's going to accelerate. It's going to become more and more important over the next few years. I hope so, because that's my job to make it so. But that's I think something that's very true. I think the other thing that is in the near term is more and more there's a growing intersectionality of interests and focus areas as well. And I think this is a great opportunity again for the new generation of people moving into the workforce, is understanding that there's really no 30 years ago you could be a chemist, right? You could just study chemistry and you could live in a little corner on your own and just do chemistry work all day. I'm not picking on chemists; it's just one example, but everything intersects now, right? Biotech is increasingly intersecting with AI. There's more and more complex relationships between fields, and I think having a broader vision and understanding of fields outside of the ones you're very specialized in is going to be increasingly important in the workforce going forwards.
Definitely. And Okay, so looking at it in terms of increasing uh, expertise, not just in terms of what you're currently doing, but what you other fields that are evolving as well. I know there's a lot of focus on AI. So how might AI change corporate relationships? Or will you always require a person there?
That's a really good question. It's like, the big picture of how much human does AI replace, and I think that that's obviously a hugely important thing to think about. And again, frankly, it's a great discussion point when you're doing that networking. Um, my general attitude is that automation comes after the lowest hanging fruits first, right? So um, we're at a point now where, you look at a car factory, right? Every one of those big robot arms can probably be programmed by AI to snap on the panel it's snapping on and weld it correctly. Those repetitive tasks, easily automatable now. We're moving into a space where, you're starting to now eat some of that white collar work, right? But again, it's the stuff that's standardizable, stuff that's repetitive, right? So, even think about writing reports or drafting or at least initial drafting of like legal briefs, those kind of things where you're taking knowledge and you're just putting it into a relatively standardized form. I'm not to diminish the work that goes on there, but that's the kind of thing you see AI increasingly becoming involved in. Where AI, I don't think will entirely replace humans is the human side of the equation. At the end of the day, AIs can mimic human behavior really well, but they're not human. And the key interface with people and technology is that user interface, right? The human machine interface, and that's where you need a human. So I think it's that's the areas where you're most human, where you need complex thought, where you need to think orthogonally and be able to draw lessons from fields far outside of the specific thing you're working in. That's the kind of thing that it's going to be very, very hard to teach an AI how to do. And so again, being a well-rounded human being, obviously expert in something that hopefully you've studied, but just being well-read, understanding the world around yourself, having knowledge of other fields, whether it's literature, history, who cares, whatever you find interesting, you can always pull in lessons from those things, and I think that's what's going to be really important as you think about building an AI-proof career, right? Is just like, what are the human behaviors that just can't be uh, replicated? And I think that's where that kind of falls.
Definitely. Definitely. And in your role, you've definitely seen a lot of trends in regards to the ratios between government funding versus private funding for universities. And one thing I'm really curious about is when funding happens in the industry, is it in the past, has it been generally constant, or has there always been like either one dominant power funding universities, such as the federal government? And how do you see that changing over the next few years?
No, I mean it's interesting actually. And, I think like a lot of things in industry and the economy, things tend to move in cycles. There was a time long before I was born where there was a lot more collaboration, certainly in certain fields, with industrial partners. If you go back to the 1940s, 50s, right, Bell Labs was this huge research institution that partnered very effectively. And you've seen that evolve, certainly through nonprofit arms, often of which have been spun out of very successful companies. You think about Howard Hughes, spun out of HMI, spun out of Hughes Aircraft. The Wellcome Trust was spun out of Burroughs Wellcome. These are major funders, and certainly outside of the U.S. I think the Wellcome Fund is probably the second biggest funder of research in the UK, right? In other countries where government funding hasn't been so readily available, there's a lot more collaboration with industry, and also particularly again with these large nonprofits. There's other sources of funds. there's obviously, wealthy individuals. The last 20, 30 years, I think what's going to be very interesting to think about going forwards is the rise of the sovereign wealth funds. These haven't historically been a huge player in academic research, but now you have these, funds from mostly oil-producing companies, Norway, the Middle East, that are trillions of dollars under management, and they frankly need something to do. Right? So I think you're going to start seeing establishment of more fundamental research through some of these entities as well. So again, these things tend to move in cycles somewhat. Obviously, in the US right now, we're undergoing a rapid readjustment, which is somewhat disruptive. But over time, I think there's opportunities for other sources of funding to step up and become more meaningful. And again, just like any other company, any company, or even your own personal finances, having a diverse portfolio of income streams is generally preferable in the long term. And that's not to say government funding isn't a good thing, but I think it's going to be more important for us thinking about going forwards to make sure that we can really maximize, how we engage with all of these sources of funding to support, foundational research that, we know has a growth benefit in society.
Definitely. Well, that was very thoughtful and also very insightful. So this is my last question to you. If you could give one piece of advice to students who are passionate about making an impact in life sciences but feel overwhelmed by the industry's complexity, what would that advice be?
Get out of your own head. Seriously, it's not that complicated. At the end of the day, all businesses are fundamentally pretty simple. We use very high-tech tools and we develop high-tech, products. But at the end of the day, I've spent many years working in startups, and it's simply about creating something that solves a problem. Product market fit is everything. Once you find that, having the tools to scale that up so that it's meaningful and you can get it to as many customers, as many people who need it as possible, that's all there is. Everything else is just nuance and technical details. So again, don't be overwhelmed. And again, think, industry has changed so much, even in like the 20 years since I was in college, right? When, I got my PhD in 2003, right? In 2003, it's the 21st century. It's not that long ago, right? But there was no such thing as social media, right? Podcasts were not a thing, right? YouTube was in its infancy, right? These huge elements of industry, society didn't even exist just over 20 years ago. Now they're fundamental to our way of life and employ a ton of people in the space. So I think, don't be overwhelmed by the complexity, but understand that, what is complex and cutting edge today is routine and blasé tomorrow. Life continually changes, and just having, for me, it's taking a relaxed attitude to it all and trying to see the bigger picture. I know it doesn't work for everyone, but just be confident in that, if you frankly work hard and are a good person to be around, then you're going to be pretty okay in life.
Definitely.
And that's it for today's episode of It's Bigger Than Biotech. And if there's one thing that Andy reminded us of, is that career paths aren't meant to be linear, and some of the most impactful work happens at the crossroads of disciplines, communities, and generations. So, whether you're building a company, joining a team, or just figuring out where you belong, don't underestimate the power of curiosity, civic mindedness, and long term thinking. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with someone who's figuring out their next step. And as always, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your biotech inspiration. Until next time, keep building, keep questioning, and remember, it's always bigger than biotech.